My dad had a job going around and checking schools to make sure everything was properly alarmed and locked down during summer breaks. He had about 15 to 20 on his list and would try to bang them out all in an evening so he could have the next few days off. He told me that one of the schools was a Catholic elementary school, very run down and old, and always gave him the creeps. There was a room that had a big-ass Virgin Mary statue and it made him feel uncomfortable whenever he'd check in there, so he never spent much time hanging around that room. The last year he did that as a job, upon closer inspection, he discovered that the statue was actually hollow, presumably so it could be moved around easier, and also that the eyes of the statue had small drill holes in them, so someone could hypothetically hide inside and watch people without them knowing. To this day that's what he speculates was happening when he'd be in there. Kinda far out, but damn, it's creepy as hell to consider. I worked as a guard in the forensics unit of a psychiatric facility a couple years back. We had a patient get violent and had to bring her to a seclusion room. In retaliation she tried to cut her wrists with her long nails. She just kept scratching and scratching. We had to go back in and hold her down until she was calm again while the nurses rendered aid. It was the bloodiest mess I've ever seen. Not exactly a security guard but a soldier, and I don't know if that counts. But I once guarded an entrance to a military base alone, maybe 3 months after I was recruited, and was greeted by a bunch of wolves, or hyenas, or something else along those lines. It was about 1 or 2 a.m. and I started hearing a lot of noises, went to check it out with my rifle, my walkie-talkie, and my flashlight. It seemed that one of the wolves, let's call them wolves, even though I'm 99% sure they weren't, killed the other one and then started to howl, and a few seconds later I started hearing howls and the sound of dogs crying and yelling around me. Suddenly I see the wolf that killed the other one walking towards me and looking me directly in the eyes. He wasn't alone, he walked with about 5 others, all coming at me. In addition, I was surrounded, but they were the only ones coming towards me. So naturally I started making noises and throwing rocks at them, but it didn't really bother them. So at one point they were way too close for comfort, so I dropped my walkie-talkie and loaded my rifle and was about to shoot. My heart was beating the fastest it ever has in my whole life, and I start yelling at them and stomping the ground with hopes that maybe this time it will work. Long story short, it did, and they left. One of the buildings on our contract was an old police station. It was a large metro police headquarters with multiple floors, all abandoned and awaiting demolition. I was exploring the cell blocks. It was creepy as hell because many of the lights didn't work, so it's pretty much just me and my flashlight beam. Suddenly I hear this shrill old-fashioned telephone ringing. I freeze, and my first thought is that it's an old-fashioned doorbell buzzer. So then I think, who in the hell is in this deserted cell block with me, and what buzzer are they pressing? In the span of a couple seconds I'm imagining the ghost of some murdered inmate pressing a buzzer so the guards will let him into the day room. Then I figured out it was the company cell phone that was ringing in my back pocket. I'd never had anyone call it before and thus didn't have any idea what the ringtone was. Had a good laugh but then decided I'd done enough exploring and left. I used to work security in hospitals. Some were for psychiatric patients, some for addicts, and some for the sick and injured. One night I was working at a hospital with psychiatry when the alarm goes off for the 3rd floor. Big alarm. Usually for aggression. I sprinted up the stairs and came to a room with 2 nurses outside sobbing and screaming. I went inside and the patient had hanged herself from the open window with a belt. If I remember correctly, could have been some bedsheets as well, it's been a while. She made sure she couldn't reach the windowsill when she hanged herself and had taken some meds to interrupt the reflex to save yourself. My first instinct was to try and lift her up. She dropped on me but she was very light. When she falls over my shoulder I hear a sigh, so I shout that she's still breathing. Everyone rushes in, CPR gets started and an ambulance is called to take her to a hospital with an emergency ward. She survives. Next day she trashes the emergency ward of another hospital I work at and gets kicked out, so yeah, you win some, you lose some. In my early 20s I worked as a contract concierge, about 15 years ago. One night I called out at work because I hated working at this particular building. The residents were always upset about something. The building was basically falling apart because it was old and, from what I understood, the homeowners association was dishonest and lazy with upkeep. Anyway, the last night I worked, the AC went out. I called the site manager to let him know what was going on. He was very rude and wanted me to write a statement summarizing everything that happened during the night. Odd to me, but okay. The residents were calling and coming down to the desk being rude. I worked overnight, which didn't make things any easier because I was by myself. I was so frustrated as to how the site manager handled the situation. I'm not a maintenance person. The next night I called out and never went back. When I spoke to the scheduler about that night, I told him I wouldn't be returning to that building. He told me it was a good thing I called out because the guy who took my shift received a call during the night to check a unit for whatever reason. He eventually had to get the master key to open the door to the unit, and the resident had hung himself in the shower. I hope the guy who took my shift is alright. Never heard anything. I would be terrified. The company I worked for did not renew their contract with this building. I quit shortly after that. One night I was passing by a playground park at around 3 a.m. and spotted an adult male and what appeared to be a kid, 5 to 6 years of age, both swinging in total silence on the swings you have for children. It was cold and rainy and both of them were poorly clothed for this type of year, and especially weather. Didn't seem homeless though. Pretty unusual stuff to do at 3 a.m. with a kid. I had lots of different things cross my mind in that moment, so decided to take a closer look since I thought I was tripping. As soon as I got close enough for them to see me, still far from them, they just stared at me for a brief second and started running as fast as they could, without a single word spoken or voice being made. Not sure where they ran because I had to scratch my eyes for a second time to check whether I was asleep or not. I've worked security on and off for several years to supplement my income, so I've heard quite a few creepy stories from coworkers. Probably the most legitimately scary story I've heard was from a guard that was working in a closed-down arena. The building is more than 100 years old but hasn't been used since the early 2000s. The city is keeping up with basic maintenance as it waits for a buyer. There's usually one guard assigned to the building. It's a 6,000-seat arena with a huge basement and 2 additional floors that have lots of old office spaces, dressing rooms and a separate, smaller community theater-type stage that's upstairs. The usual guard is doing his rounds through the building. The building itself is very interesting, as it's largely unchanged since the heydays of the 70s and 80s. The upper floors are largely dark and are pretty creepy. Anyway, the guard is doing his normal rounds but feels unnaturally creeped out. It's his normal post but something feels different today. He's feeling jumpy but shakes it off and continues. He's a very diligent guy, so he walks every floor of the building. He's in the very top of the catwalk system above the main arena where the old spotlighting equipment was. It's a narrow wooden catwalk. Suddenly he hears a loud creak behind him, like someone is walking. He spins around and sees a guy standing there. The guy is frozen mid-stride like he's been tiptoeing up behind him. Guy has an unsettling, mischievous-looking smile on his face like he's been caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Dude has a big steel pipe in his hand instead of a cookie though. The guard pulls his gun and the guy takes off running in the opposite direction and disappears into the labyrinth of the building. Cops come and sweep the building with a canine but don't find him. They do find that he's been playing in the dust that's on top of the old concession counters. He had written a bunch of bizarre helter-skelter type unsettling rhymes and drew a bunch of stick figures hanging from nooses. The speculation is that it was some crazy homeless guy who had been hiding in the building for a few days and had made a game of following the guards without them knowing it. One of my old co-workers said that old hospitals and nursing homes were the creepiest places to work. He tells a story about when he was assigned to an old condemned nursing home. The place was empty and waiting to be torn down. The only people in the building are security. It's his first night there, so the on-duty guard is giving him the rundown before shift change. The security post is set up at what used to be the central nurses' station. He hears a ringing behind the desk and asks the other guard what it is. Regular guard says that in the old days the patients had a buzzer system to ring the nurse if they needed something. He asks who's ringing the buzzer. The guard tells him all the entrances are secure and there's no one in the building, but the buzzers occasionally go off in the night. I asked him if he ever went to rooms that rang the buzzer and he said, hell no. Thanks for watching. Subscribe below for more.